entirely comprised of sustainability principles. In that, we identified climate change as, yes, the greatest threat to the long-term economic growth of California and the global economy, but we also identified the growth of corporate social responsibility and the role that innovation, i.e. a lot of activity around private equity, could play for California in moving forward. So after a couple of years as State Deputy Controller, I returned back to the state legislature for the specific reason that we were about to implement AB 32, which in the United States was the very first climate change. It was the greenhouse gas reduction targets, and it was also the subject of a proposition to shut it down in November. So it's been quite controversial, but that was the reason that I returned, to try to help in the implementation in the United States for that. Probably the most significant thing that keeps me awake at night is this. From a public policy perspective, sustainability offers something very unique. Prior to going forward on sustainability, as you looked at issues, you would say, this is what I wish to do, and these are the negative environmental and social consequences. And so you start with a good and you take away. In sustainability, for the first time, it was like a light went on in my head. For the first time, we had an opportunity to look at the economic, social, and environmental consequences, and to shoot towards strength. Come up with what was the best answer for all going forward, rather than trying to come up with a negative to mitigate a potential negative impact of low wages or pollution. So I think that there's a variety of models that we're going to talk about in going forward on what is integrating ESG. But I think that we probably haven't really come into the modern strategies around ESG. When I was at the representative to the CalPERS and CalSTRAT board, in fact, they took some unique approaches. They didn't decide that they would only use one approach, but they actually created spring-fed pools to actually test out the different approaches. So perhaps we'll get into a chance to talk about that later.
Tony, thank you so much for that. Let's kick off with one of the questions that I think you've all touched upon and that you've all said is important, but still I'm trying to understand more about what it means in practice, which is the issue of integration. Because we are all saying that integration is important, but I'd like to ask you if a couple of panelists could give me some examples of what does actually ESG integration mean in practice? You know, what are some examples of what you've done and what have you done successfully? And maybe, you know, what are some of the mistakes that you've made in trying to integrate? Who would like to kick that one off? Peter is smiling. Go ahead.
I think conceptually, the idea of integration, everyone agrees, it makes sense to do it. You know, if there are environmental, social, and governance factors which are potentially material, then yeah, you should integrate them into the analysis of the company, and that should affect your view of the risk and return relationship for that particular investment. In practice, it gets a lot trickier than that. And I think what we have found is that you have to start by thinking, okay, well, first of all, identify which ESG or sustainability factors can actually potentially be material to the investment class that you're looking at. So, you know, if I'm looking at UK equities, poverty and hunger in Africa is a very important, social issue globally, but it's not particularly material, or likely to be particularly material to, my selection of investments in the UK equity space. However, climate change legislation is. But then within climate change legislation, there's a variety of time periods, there's a variety of degrees of importance depending on the particular sort of investment area we're looking at. And so the sort of rather obvious idea of saying, okay, well, climate change is an important constraint on investment. It's a big E factor, environmental factor. Therefore, we must invest in anything to do with coal mining. That is too simplistic. Because although it might be true in sort of 30 years' time, that's not a meaningful investment horizon for most of our clients, for most asset owners. So the thing that we have found is the sweet spot for ESG thematic integration is to look about 18 months to 2 years out. So to look for a particular driver or catalyst, and an example might be pollution control regulation in China. So on catalytic converters, the Chinese are rapidly reducing the amount of emissions that are allowed to come out of their cars. I believe they're now at a more stringent level in terms of new cars than the United States is. So having a trigger like that is something that works quite well for an investment in a company like Johnson Matthey, which produce catalytic converters for about a third of the world's cars. And the way we do it is we take that particular issue, we build it into a financial model for that company to say, okay, well, what's priced in now? And is this going to be something which improves the returns or reduces the returns, and what's the risks surrounding that? And so that sort of integration works quite well. And we've had great success in doing that. The one that's maybe a bit trickier is around government, so in terms of financial institutions, looking at particularly the example of the financial crisis. It was very difficult to identify which companies were exposed to subprime mortgage lending, and particularly the derivatives of that, so the CDOs, etc. So in that case, greater disclosure is something that we need as an industry. We need it across the board in looking at those material issues. But with hindsight, what we could all have done with, and what we could all have done with concentrating on, was looking at the incentive structures within banks. Is it a kind of get as rich as you can in as short a period as you can, type non-sharing governments, or is it something which is more long-term, steadier? And I would argue that the latter should get a much, much lower risk attributed to it in form. So it's exceptionally difficult in certain cases, it's easier in others, but the important thing to do is to have a rigorous process to dedicate resources to it, and also fundamentally to ask different questions than the questions which everyone else is asking, because only then can you come to a different conclusion.
Thank you, Peter. So looking at the different asset classes and identifying the issues that are essential to those, having perhaps a 12 to 18 month time horizon, and then also the importance of the incentive structures, which I think is an emerging issue in this field. Don, you said that you wanted to spend more time on the integration of ESG issues in your role as a trustee. How will you do that? Any of the things that Peter is saying, is that something that's useful to you? What sort of approaches, what will you do specifically when it comes to integration?
I mean, we draw a distinction between engagement, which we've been heavily involved in for many years now, and actual integration, because we believe that integration is more about how we approach it and how we integrate that into our investment process rather than the entities in which we invest. So if you like, it's about behaviours as far as we're concerned. So one of the sorts of areas that we're looking at actively, and there's some discussion, and there's some discussion on this at both the PRI conference and at ICGN in San Francisco last month. There's the whole issue of mandate, because unless we are clear, unless the asset owners are clear about what our investment beliefs are and what our objectives are, then nobody else in the financial industry actually knows what we're after. So we're all talking about short-termism, it's very bad. But in actual fact, the truth of the matter is that our behaviours as asset owners don't necessarily contribute towards long-termism, because we're putting, or have put traditionally, far too much emphasis on quarterly returns. We have had the wrong incentivisation process.